The night I finally called him, my hands were shaking so hard I dropped my phone twice. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor of my own apartment, back pressed against the cold tile wall, listening to footsteps pace back and forth outside the door. Dominic's footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, the kind that told me exactly what kind of mood he was in. I had 2 contacts pulled up on my screen, my sister in Kelowna, who I hadn't spoken to in 8 months, because Dominic said she was toxic and trying to sabotage us, and Brennan. I chose Brennan. Even now, I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because he was the only person in my life that Dominic had never managed to poison. Maybe because I'd seen, over 14 months of working as his office coordinator, that he was the kind of man who answered his phone. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I was just so desperate, I called the one number I knew wouldn't send me to voicemail. The phone rang twice. Tatum. His voice was low, a little rough, like he'd been awake but barely. "It's past midnight, what's wrong?" I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Just air. Just the sound of Dominic's footsteps stopping outside the bathroom door. "Tatum, I'm sorry," I whispered. I didn't know who else to call. A pause. Then, very quietly, "Where are you?" I should tell you about Dominic first, because none of this makes sense without him, or rather, without understanding how thoroughly I lost myself to him. We met at a fundraising gala for Sick Kids Foundation in Toronto. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Effortlessly, dangerously, in a way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He was in finance. He wore a watch that cost more than my monthly rent. He laughed at my jokes and remembered, 3 weeks later, that I'd mentioned I liked Ethiopian food, and took me to a place in Little Ethiopia that I'd never have found on my own. I was 26. I was new to Toronto, still figuring out the city, still building a life after leaving my hometown of Sudbury. I was exactly the kind of person Dominic was looking for, I think. Someone a little unmoored, someone who would be grateful. The control started so slowly I genuinely didn't see it. First it was small things. He didn't like when I wore certain things out. He said it wasn't jealousy. It was that he cared about how people perceived me. He didn't like my friend group from work. They were immature, not good for my career. He said it with such calm authority that I found myself nodding along, slowly editing my life down to fit whatever shape he wanted it to be. By the time I was 27, my world had narrowed to Dominic, my job, and the apartment we shared in Liberty Village that he paid for and never let me forget. My job was the one thing he couldn't fully touch, and I think that's because, on some level, he didn't understand it. I worked as an office coordinator for Brennan Wolf's private investment firm in the financial district. Small team, tight-knit. I managed schedules, correspondence, vendor relationships, the kind of quiet operational work that keeps everything running without anyone noticing. Dominic thought it was beneath me. He told me often that I should be looking for something more prestigious, more visible. What he meant was that he wanted me somewhere he had more leverage. But I liked my job. I liked the routine of it, the clear expectations, the satisfaction of a day where everything ran smoothly. And I liked, cautiously, carefully, the man I worked for. Brennan Wolf was not an easy person to know. He was 38, private and operated with a kind of deliberate economy. He didn't waste words, didn't waste movement, didn't waste time on things he found pointless. He'd built his firm from nothing over 12 years, and the people who'd worked with him from the early days spoke about him with a particular kind of loyalty that you don't manufacture. You either earn it or you don't. He intimidated me for the first 3 months. I called him Mr. Wolf and tried to stay invisible. Then, about 4 months in, I completely misread his calendar and accidentally double-booked him into 2 client meetings on the same Thursday afternoon. One in Yorkville, one downtown. I discovered the mistake at 9 a.m. I spent 40 minutes quietly panicking before I went to his office, knocked on the open door, and told him exactly what I'd done. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay, which one do you think I should reschedule?" I blinked. Sorry? You know my clients. You know my schedule better than anyone. Which one do you think we move? I told him. He nodded once, said do it, and went back to his email. That was the first time I thought, this man might actually trust me. We didn't become friends exactly. It wasn't that kind of workplace. But over the following year, there was a slow accumulation of small moments. Him leaving a coffee on my desk. On the mornings I looked exhausted. Me learning that he took notes by hand and hated being asked for updates in writing. The easy rhythm that develops when two people are good at their jobs and respect each other's time. He started calling me Tate somewhere around month 7. And I let it happen without really thinking about why. At home, things with Dominic were deteriorating in that quiet, grinding way that's hard to name while you're living through it. He'd gotten laid off in the fall. His firm in Bay Street had a round of cuts and he was among them. And the version of Dominic that emerged from that wasn't the charming man from the gala. He was home all day. He tracked my schedule with an obsessiveness that he framed as concern. He started going through my phone when he thought I was asleep. He picked fights about nothing, and then somehow made the aftermath feel like my fault. I walked on eggshells in my own home. I rehearsed what I was going to say before I said it. I learned to read the quality of his silence, whether it was safe silence or the kind that meant something was coming. I told no one. I was ashamed. I was also, for a long time, still convinced this was a rough patch, that the Dominic who'd taken me to that Ethiopian restaurant was real, and this version was temporary. I kept waiting for the man I'd fallen in love with to come back. He didn't. The first time Brennan noticed was a Tuesday in November. I'd spent the weekend navigating one of Dominic's worst stretches. 2 days of cold, punishing silence that ended when I apologized for something I hadn't done. And I came to work Monday morning, running on 4 hours of sleep, and the kind of blankness that comes from exhausting your emotions completely. I made it through Monday on autopilot. Tuesday, I was sitting at my desk trying to draft a response to a vendor contract when I just stopped, stared at the screen, couldn't find the words. Brennan walked past, paused, backed up, looked at me. "Take a break," he said. "I'm fine. You've been staring at that same email for 20 minutes. Take a break, Tate." I went to the kitchen and made tea I didn't drink. When I came back, there was a message on my desk, handwritten, which was unusual. It said, "If something's going on, you don't have to talk about it, but I'm around if you do." I folded it up and put it in my pocket and cried in the bathroom for 4 minutes. Then I went back to work. I didn't tell him anything. Not then, but I thought about that note more than I should have. Things escalated with Dominic in January. He'd started a new position in December, less prestigious than his previous role, which meant he came home with a particular kind of wounded pride that needed somewhere to go. I became where it went. The night it finally broke open, we'd argued about something I genuinely cannot remember now. Money, maybe. Or my hours. Or the fact that I'd mentioned getting coffee with a colleague from work, and he'd wanted the colleague's name, and I'd said it was just a group thing from the office, and he'd said I was being evasive. What I remember is the way the apartment felt. Too small, too loud, the walls doing nothing to absorb the pressure. And then his hand coming down hard on the kitchen counter. Not on me, never directly on me. Dominic was too controlled for that, but close enough that I flinched. Close enough that my body made a decision before my brain caught up. I went to the bathroom. I locked the door. My hands were shaking. I sat on the floor and pulled up my contacts. My sister's name was there. 8 months since we'd spoken. I didn't even know if she'd pick up. Brennan's name was there because I had all the work contacts in my phone. That was just logistics. That was just my job. I called him. Tatum. His was low, a little rough, like he'd been awake but barely. "It's past midnight. What's wrong? I'm sorry," I whispered. I didn't know who else to call. A pause. Then, very quietly, "Where are you?" "Home." I stopped, exhaled. "I'm okay. I needed to hear a voice. "Are you safe?" I thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was that I wasn't sure anymore. He hasn't. It's not Tatum. His voice had changed, gone very flat, very steady. "Are you safe right now in that room?" "Yes. The door's locked. Stay there. I'm coming." "Brennan, you don't have to." "I'm coming," he said again, and hung up. He showed up 23 minutes later. I know because I counted every one of them. I unlocked the front door when he texted me he was downstairs. Dominic was in the bedroom by then. I don't know if he heard the door or just retreated on his own. And I opened the apartment door, and Brennan was standing in the hallway in a jacket over what were clearly sleep clothes, and he took one look at me, and his jaw went tight. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't make a scene. He just said, "Get whatever you need. You're not staying here tonight." "I can't just—" "Yes," he said. "You can." I packed a bag in 8 minutes. I moved through the apartment like I was in someone else's body. Dominic appeared in the bedroom doorway when I was getting my coat. He saw Brennan standing in the hall, and something complicated crossed his face. Something that was trying to be territorial, but had caught, I think, on the particular way Brennan was looking at him. Brennan didn't say a word to him. He put his hand briefly on my back, just guiding, just present, and we left. In the elevator, I started shaking again. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't know why I called you. That was—" "Stop apologizing," he said. I stopped, pressed my lips together. "I'm glad you called," he said, quietly, like it cost him something to say. "I'm glad you called me." I stayed with my colleague Fiona that night. She had a spare room in her Leslieville apartment, and I'd called her from Brennan's car, and she said yes before I'd even finished the sentence. Brennan drove me there himself. He sat with me in the car outside her building for a few minutes after I said I was fine, just looking at me like he was doing a calculation. "You're going to have to make some decisions," he said finally. "I know, not tonight, but soon. I know. You don't have to do any of it alone." I looked at him. In the dim light of the car, he looked tired in a way he didn't let himself look at work. Like some layer of professional distance had been peeled back, and underneath it was just a person who was worried about someone he cared about. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He looked at the dashboard for a moment. Then, "Because someone should have done it sooner. I didn't know what to say to that." So I just said thank you, and got out of the car and went inside. I stood in Fiona's hallway for a long time before I could move. I didn't go back to Dominic. That's the short version, and it makes it sound easier than it was. The long version is 6 weeks of logistics that felt, every single day, like trying to untangle myself from a net I'd spent 2 years weaving around myself. I had to figure out the apartment, which was in his name. I had to find somewhere to live. I ended up subletting a place in East York from a friend of Fiona's, small but clean, a ground floor unit with a decent kitchen and a landlord who let me sign month to month while I got sorted. I had to rebuild a budget from scratch because we'd had that particular kind of financial entanglement where the accounts were separate, but the spending was so intertwined. I had no idea what my actual life cost on my own. For a while, I calculated it constantly. My salary from the firm covered my rent and basics with room to spare. I'd always made decent money. I just stopped paying attention to it when Dominic decided he was the one who managed finances. Getting that understanding back, learning to trust my own numbers again, was its own small kind of healing. Dominic didn't accept the breakup quietly. There were texts, first pleading, then cold, then angry. Cycling through so many times my phone started to feel like a hazard. I blocked him everywhere after the 3rd week and told myself not to feel guilty about it, which took more effort than I would have liked. At work, I was careful. I was professional. I came in every day and did my job because the job was something I could do well, even when everything else was rubble. Brennan was careful too. He didn't treat me differently, didn't soften edges or walk on eggshells around me, which I was grateful for, because I needed something in my life to feel normal. He kept the same steady rhythm, left coffee on my desk on the mornings he could tell I'd had a rough night, and didn't ask about things unless I offered them. The offering started slowly. About a month out, I knocked on his open office door after everyone else had gone home. He looked up. "I never actually thanked you properly," I said. "You don't need to. I want to." I stayed in the doorway. "I've been thinking about that night a lot, about why I called you. And I think it was because you were the one person in my life at that point that I knew would just handle it, not panic, not make it about them. Just handle it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad I could be that. You didn't even hesitate," I said. That whole drive over, I kept thinking, this is crazy, I'm going to have to explain this tomorrow, and it's going to be so awkward, and you just showed up. "Of course I showed up," he said, and the simplicity of it hit me somewhere in the chest. I said goodnight and went home, but I thought about it the whole way back on the TTC. The months that followed were the work of putting myself back together, and I want to be honest about that. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't graceful, it was just slow. I started seeing a therapist in the annex who specialized in relationships with coercive control patterns. And the first few sessions felt almost pointless, like trying to excavate something buried so deep I couldn't find the edges of it. But eventually, things started to shift. I started to recognize patterns I'd been living inside without seeing them. I started to get angry, which my therapist said was a good sign. It meant I was done blaming myself. Spring came. I learned my neighborhood. I found a farmer's market on Saturday mornings near Pape Station that I walked to every week, and bought vegetables I was relearning how to cook just for myself. I called my sister in Kelowna. That first call lasted 3 hours. I cried for most of it. She didn't say, "I told you so," even once, which is its own kind of love. At work, something was shifting with Brennan in a way I was trying not to examine too directly. We'd always gotten along. That quiet professional respect that had built up over a year and a half. But now there were edges to it that were harder to ignore. He started asking my opinion on things beyond my operational purview. We started having conversations that lasted longer than they needed to, that wandered into territory that had nothing to do with work. He learned, somewhere in there, that I'd grown up in Sudbury and had opinions about Northern Ontario that he found genuinely interesting. I learned that he'd spent his 20s in Vancouver before coming to Toronto, that he had a sister in Halifax he was close to, that he got unexpectedly animated talking about economic infrastructure policy in a way that would have been nerdy if it wasn't also kind of charming. I noticed things, that he watched the door when I left on my lunch break and relaxed when I came back, that when my voice went flat and careful, a remnant of all those months of self-editing, he'd wait rather than fill the silence, like he understood that I'd say the thing eventually if I wasn't pushed. I noticed that he kept calling me Tate in that same easy way he always had, and that I'd started to like it in a way that had stopped being professional. I said nothing. I was not ready to say anything. In June, Dominic reappeared. I'd thought, naively, I see now, that going quiet meant going away. It didn't. He showed up at my building one evening. I didn't buzz him in. He stood in the lobby and called me 14 times in a row, and when I didn't answer he left a voicemail that was very quiet, very controlled, and more frightening for it. He said he just wanted to talk. He said I owed him that. I called the non-emergency police line. An officer came, took a report, told me my options, was genuinely helpful. I started the paperwork for a peace bond. My therapist connected me with a legal advocacy organization, CLEO, which does free legal guidance in Ontario, and I went through the process with their help. But there was a night in between the voicemail and the paperwork where I was sitting in my apartment with the lights off because somehow that felt safer, and my phone buzzed. It was Brennan, working late. "You want to grab dinner?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed, "Yes," somewhere with good lighting and a lot of people. There was a pause then. "I know a place. Half an hour?" He took me to a ramen spot on Baldwin Street that was warm and busy and smelled incredible. We sat across from each other and he let me order first, and I told him, in the middle of explaining the tonkotsu versus miso situation, what had happened with Dominic. Just said it, flatly, in between menu decisions, like if I didn't make a big deal of it maybe it would feel manageable. He put down his menu. "What did the police say?" "They were helpful. I'm filing for a peace bond." "Good, that's the right move." He was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" "Scared," I said, which was the most honest I'd been out loud in a while. But also, a little angry, and the anger feels better. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'd imagine it does. My therapist keeps telling me that anger is a healthy sign." "Your therapist sounds right." I laughed. It surprised me, the way it came out. Genuine, involuntary. I hadn't laughed in a few days. Brennan looked at me when I laughed, and I saw something in his face that I'd been carefully not looking at for a while, because I didn't know what to do with it yet. We stayed for 2 hours. We talked about everything and nothing. His firm's expansion plans, my sister's new job, a documentary we'd both apparently watched separately, and had opinions about. By the time we left, Baldwin Street had gone quiet, and the June air was that specific Toronto summer warmth that never quite comes off after dark. On the sidewalk, he said, "Are you okay to get home? I have the TTC Tate." The way he said it made me look up. "Are you okay to get home? Will you drive me?" "Yes," he said immediately. In the car 2 blocks from my building, I said, "Brennan, yeah, I know things are complicated right now. I know I'm probably still too close to everything to see clearly." "You are," he said, which was honest enough that I appreciated it. "But I want to say something. Okay. I see how you are with me. I've seen it for a while. And I want you to know that I see it. And I'm not going to pretend I don't." He pulled up to my building, put the car in park, For a moment, he just looked at the street ahead. I know it's not the right time, he said finally. I'm not asking anything from you, Tate. I just want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I know, I said. That's why I said it. I got out of the car. I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. The peace bond came through in September. Dominic was served, signed, legally obligated to stay out of my life. My hands didn't even shake when the legal advocate called to tell me. I went for a walk afterward, down along the waterfront at Harborfront. Just me and the lake and the early September light, and I let myself feel the smallness of it. Just a person free, beside a very large body of water. It sounds nothing. It was everything. I'd been seeing my therapist for 6 months by then. I was starting to trust my own instincts again. A strangely difficult thing to rebuild, the faith in your own read of a situation, when you've spent years having it quietly dismantled. But it was coming back. I could feel it. I could feel, too, that I was ready for something I hadn't been ready for before. On a Friday evening in October, I stayed late to finish a project. When I came out of the conference room, Brennan's office light was still on. I knocked. "You're still here," he said, looking up. "Finishing the Harrington file." I leaned against the doorframe. "You?" "Waiting," he said, and then looked like he hadn't meant to say it quite like that. I looked at him for a moment. At this man who had driven across the city at midnight without being asked. Who had never once, in the months since, made it uncomfortable or strange or something I had to manage. Who had given me the extraordinary gift of just being steady while I found my footing. "Brennan," I said. "Yeah, I'm ready." He went very still. "I've been thinking about this for a while," I said. I wanted to wait until I was sure. Until I wasn't just reaching for something safe because everything else was frightening. I wanted it to be a real choice. "Is it?" he asked, not demanding, just needing to know. "Yes," I said. "I chose this. I'm choosing this." He stood up from his desk, crossed the room. Stood close enough that I had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "Tate," he said softly. "Yeah, I've been waiting a while, I know," I said. "Thank you for that." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from my face, very gently, the way you touch something you've been careful with for a long time. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just didn't want to rush you. You didn't." We stood there in the quiet office, city lights scattered across the windows, the whole of downtown Toronto doing its ordinary Friday evening thing far below us. Two people at the start of something chosen freely, entered into clearly, built on a foundation of months of watching each other be exactly who we were. He took my hand. "Dinner," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Dinner. I know how this sounds. I know that from the outside there are 100 ways to read it wrong. The boss, the employee, the timing, the rescue. I've read those concerns from the inside too, turned them over carefully, brought them to therapy, and looked at them honestly. What I know is this. Brennan never held the night I called him over my head, never used the gratitude or the vulnerability to position himself. He waited. He was consistent. When I was ready, it was because I had rebuilt myself first, not because I needed him to complete me. What I know is that I am not the same person who sat on a bathroom floor wondering if she was safe. I am someone who filed a peace bond, found her own apartment, called her sister back, learned to cook for herself, learned to trust her own voice again. He was part of how I got here, but he was never the only part. That distinction matters, and I want to be clear about it. This past spring, we had dinner with my sister when she came through Toronto. She was connecting through Pearson on her way to a conference in Montreal. The three of us sat in a restaurant on King Street West, and my sister talked too loudly and laughed at her own jokes and spent a frankly excessive amount of time interrogating Brennan about his views on healthcare funding, which he answered with genuine seriousness, which she later told me was the thing that convinced her he was worth keeping. At one point, I excused myself to use the restroom, and when I came back they were talking, leaning toward each other over the table, and Brennan had this expression on his face. Something open and easy, not the guarded version he showed to most of the world, and I stood there in the doorway of the restaurant and thought, look at this, look at how far. Later, walking back to the car, he put his arm around my shoulders in that easy way he had, and said, "Your sister might be my favorite person. Don't tell her that. She'll be insufferable. She loves you very much." "I know," I said. I almost didn't call her back. That scares me sometimes when I think about it. He pulled me a little closer. "But you did. I did. We walked the rest of the way in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. The city moved around us. Streetcars, laughter from a patio, the smell of a coffee shop wedged between two taller buildings, the particular low gold of autumn in Toronto, when the light sits just right on the leaves. I had chosen this, all of it, not as an escape, not as a rescue, not as anything other than a life I had built, piece by piece, from the rubble of a very hard 2 years. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was mine.